All right, I've succeeded in staring you down into silence. Hey, we've really saved the best for last, an extraordinary speaker. We've got Robert Kaplan here as our final keynote speaker. He's recognized, obviously, as one of the world's leading thinkers and writers on global affairs, and in fact has twice made the list of Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers. He's a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a senior advisor at Eurasia Group. He's a best-selling author of 17 books, all of which are currently in print. His latest book is Earning the Rockies: How Geography Shapes America's Role in the World. He's been an extraordinary guest at the War College, and we're honored to have him here as our final keynote speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And again, it's a great honor to be back at the War College for the Strategy Forum. And what I'd like to do is give you a tour of the world in about 35, 40 minutes. And I'm sure there are areas I won't get to, and you can raise them in the Q&A afterwards. First of all, let me start at 30,000 feet and then get down to ground level. Technology is not defeating geography. What's happened is that technology has shrunk geography and made it smaller so that the world is more anxious, more claustrophobic, more tied together than ever before. But it's like my wristwatch. It may be small, and you have even smaller watches, but to understand it, you have to take it apart to see all the wheels and gears and, and everything that makes it tick. And that's why river systems, ports, mountain ranges, etc., are more important now than they've ever been, precisely because the world is more integrated and smaller. Globalization means integration, but integration means more points of interconnection. And the more points there are of interconnection, the more possibility for military and other kinds of flare-ups. So it's precisely because of globalization and because of integration that the world today is more anxious and claustrophobic than it's ever been in its history, because every place matters in a way that it didn't. If you just pluck one string somewhere, the whole web vibrates. The whole strategic web of the world vibrates. People talk about short, sharp wars in the South China Sea. I don't believe it. Precisely because of connectivity, wars and conflicts have a means to migrate to other regions in a way that they never had before. So that the conflicts or the rivalries in the Baltic Sea Basin, the Black Sea Basin, the East and South China Seas are more interrelated than one could ever have imagined a few decades ago. In fact, the word Eurasia has a meaning in the way that it didn't a decade ago. A decade ago, it was just a geographic term for the supercontinent. But now we have a cohering Eurasian conflict system that never existed before. And now let me go lower into details, but let me just give you one example of what I mean. Take India and China, for instance. India and China, for most of history, were two great world civilizations that really did not have much to do with each other. They were separated by the high wall of the Himalayas. Yes, Buddhism spread from the Indian subcontinent into what is today China in Middle Antiquity. And yes, the Opium Wars brought the two parts of Asia together in a conflict system. But those were aberrations. Those were exceptions to the rule. But because of the way that military technology has defeated distance, We now have an Indian intercontinental ballistic missile system that can hit any city in China. You have Chinese fighter jets in Tibet that can include India in their arc of operations. You have Indian warships occasionally in the South China Sea. You have Chinese warships through, more and more in the Indian Ocean. You have Chinese port building projects throughout the Indian Ocean in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Tanzania, etc. You have the Chinese building a military facility in Djibouti at the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, all of which are surrounding India. So it's precisely because of technology that a new geography of rivalry has been created between India and China that never existed before. So this is how technology enhances geography rather than defeats it. And I could play this out throughout the world in other examples. I just happen to use India and China. All right, let me go lower and talk about, I'm going to talk about the Middle East, Europe, and then finally Asia. All right, the Middle East. Why is there so much conflict? Why do we have failed states, semi-failed states? What's happening in our era that you don't read about in the newspapers? What's happening is that for the first time in modern history, the Middle East is in a post-imperial situation. Empire and imperialism may be dirty words in the current academic world, but in fact, most of human history, human beings have been governed by one empire or another. The European empires were merely the top slither of an imperial system, a tradition that goes back to dozens of Chinese empires, Iranian empires, Indian empires, even African empires. 100 years ago, in 1918, the Ottoman Turkish Empire collapsed in the Middle East. So that was one imperial system gone. During the Ottoman rule, you might have had instability, wars, but you didn't have the fight and the argument over territory between Sunnis and Shiites and Arabs and Jews in Palestine because everyone owed fealty and sovereignty to the Sultan. You know, everyone's political boss was ultimately the Turkish Sultan in Constantinople. That's gone. It went away in 1918. And if you ask me, the Middle East 100 years later has still not found a solution to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Then you have the British and French imperial mandate systems, which governed, may not have governed fairly or nicely, but they governed what is today the Levant, what is today Greater Syria and Greater Iraq. That disappeared in the years following World War II. Then you had the rule of what I call post-imperial strongmen. People like Gaddafi in Libya, the Assad family in Syria, the string of Iraqi military dictators that started in 1958 that only culminated with Saddam Hussein in the late 1970s. Who are these people? Why do I call them post-imperial? Because they governed according to borders that were drawn up by the European colonialists that often were averse to ethnic and sectarian boundaries, and therefore they had to invent new secular forms of state identity in order to govern. And they governed. May not have been nice, but they governed. And they're all gone, or mostly gone. Then you had the American system, which is the British Oxford scholar John Darwin calls imperialism in all but name. In other words, no American official will ever use the word imperial system to define what we are in the world, but that doesn't mean it doesn't really exist itself. Let me move on to Asia, where again, you have this question about the continuation of the American-led order. Why are we reading so much about the South China Sea, the East China Sea? Why is this in the news so much? Because these territorial disputes roots in some cases go back centuries. Why now? Again, there's a deep underlying reason. Asia is the opposite of the Middle East. Instead of weak or failed states, you have strong states. Throughout the Cold War, Asian countries were internally focused. But the truth is that 3 decades of double-digit economic growth does not lead to peace and freedom. It leads to military acquisitions. So China has built, ballistic missile system, air force, and it's done so for the same reasons the United States did so between the end of the Civil War and the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. America became rich. It had double-digit economic growth rates for most of the years between 1865 and 1898, and thus we had new trading relationships around the world, new security concerns, and a question of status entered into it. We felt we deserved a great military. China is following the same path. All these states which were internally focused, they're now at peace. They've been building infrastructures, bureaucracies. They've become strong, and what do? They acquire militaries, and they project power outwards, and that leads to disagreements about who controls what in what area of the South and East China Sea. It's a very normal historical pattern. The conflicts and rivalries in the South and East China Seas represent the result of development, of economic development. Success stories don't lead to peace in world history. They lead to a new level of military rivalry, and that's what's happened. You can talk to the Chinese all day about why they shouldn't be doing what they're doing in the South and East China Seas, and they will not be convinced because they should not be convinced. Another thing is China is very worried about the Muslim Turkic Uyghurs in Western China. The Uyghurs are a greater threat to China than the Tibetans are, because the Tibetans, of course, already operate in the international system. They have a Dalai Lama who's used to speaking to international diplomats. The Tibetans can be negotiated with. They have a cosmopolitan elite of their own. They've taken back Macau and Hong Kong. They continue to soften up Taiwan, which is a decade-long process, because the Chinese goal is to win and extend your territory without ever having to fight. Because simply by having to fight means you made a miscalculation somewhere along the line. So I think that's a real threat that the Russians